Okay, so we've had a day to digest this weird story from CNN in which three Iranian boats supposedly ordered a UK oil tanker in the Persian Gulf. I think it was specifically in the Strait of Hormuz when this occurred, to sail into Iranian waters and be detained. Now, this supposedly was Iran's answer to the UK detaining an Iranian ship in the Mediterranean at their port in Gibraltar. After all, Iran did say that they were going to retaliate against the UK, and many people had suspected that this would be in the form of Iran seizing a UK oil tanker and then basically saying, we're not going to release yours until you release ours. However, the Iranians are denying this vehemently. Now, you could say that they're only denying it because they supposedly failed in hijacking this. And that seems plausible enough until you realize that the U.S., at the very least, claims to have footage of this incident. Footage which, ostensibly would be able to implicate the Iranians in it. And so therefore, what's their point in lying? And of course, the reason why the U.S. claims to have footage of this incident is because a U.S. Navy ship, I believe, was escorting this oil tanker through the Strait of Hormuz, specifically in case it were attacked by Iran. So if Iran were going to seize an oil tanker, why would they attack one that has a U.S. escort? I mean, that would seem to lend some credence to Iran's story, in my mind, because not all ships are escorted through the Strait of Hormuz. Most of them are not. They just happened, supposedly, to pick one that was being escorted by the U.S. I don't know if that was just stupidity or poor planning or naivete about how easy it would be or arrogance. Now, of course, the one way to solve this once and for all would be for the U.S. or the U.K., because I'm sure they both have the tape, to just simply put out this tape that they claim they have. This would all be resolved if the public was allowed to see the video of these Iranians supposedly trying to take over this UK tanker. And of course, they should have recordings of the radio communications because the Iranians reportedly messaged this tanker and said, hey, you're going to need to pull into Iran and and surrender, or else we're going to attack you. The UK, however, refuses to release any of this so-called evidence, which is making their story a bit suspicious in my mind and the minds of many others. This does not seem at all as cut and dry, even as the dubious claims of Iranian involvement in the bombings of those tankers this past month or so ago. Because at least then, there was an incident in which Iran may be implicated. You could argue whether or not Iran was actually behind those tanker bombings. However, you could not dispute the fact that those tanker bombings did in fact occur, because there were tankers that were on fire, at least one. And there was another tanker from Sweden that had a hole in the hull. So you knew something happened. It was just a matter of what. Here we have no evidence that anything happened, and in fact we have pretty strong evidence that would seem to suggest that this would not have happened. Because again, the whole point of a U.S. escort is not to fight off Iranian attacks, it is to deter Iranian attacks. And if in fact this tanker did have a U.S. escort, and that escort did not deter the Iranians from attacking, that should set off alarm bells for the folks who are on the fence about whether or not escorting the ships through the Straits of Hormuz is such a great idea. Because if that won't deter Iran, then if your country has a Navy ship that is escorting one of these tankers, and your job is to guard these British ships, and you have to fire on Iranian ships, then you could end up getting your country into a war with Iran inadvertently. But as I looked at this story sort of not develop, but digest in the minds of many people over the past 24 hours, it would seem to me that it's more and more clear that this so-called incident does in fact have a lot to do with trying to manipulate people's perceptions, or at least their view of the idea that other countries other than the U.S. Should be escorting ships through the Strait of Hormuz. You may recall that the U.S. has been making a renewed push in the past few days to trying to get other countries to sign up to this program, sort of an international coalition of navies that are going to guard the ships as they cross the Strait of Hormuz, which is, of course, the big choke point in which the Iranians would want to try and seize a ship and steer it into, one of their ports. And the other countries that the U.S. has been soliciting haven't been so hot about it. There really has been no one who's stepped up and said, hey, we'll offer ships to this program. We'll help the U.S. try and guard these ships in the Strait of Hormuz. Because, of course, the U.S. Themselves doesn't actually want to offer any ships, which is interesting, considering that the U.S. Navy, even on their own commercials here in the U.S., says, hey, our job is to protect global commerce. They don't say anything about protecting America. They say our job is to protect global commerce and make sure that folks around the world who are in the shipping industry have free security. That's what the U.S. Navy does. So it seems very telling to me that the U.S. doesn't want to have their ships doing all this work. Perhaps maybe they're too overextended, but I find that hard to believe. There's a lot of ships in the U.S. Navy that they could send to the Persian Gulf, I would imagine, to escort some oil tankers. And so it is this lack of interest in participating in the U.S.'s planned escort program that some believe may have led to the U.S. and the U.K., more specifically the U.S., coming up with this scheme, this story, which may or may not have been faked, as some kind of a false flag to try and encourage other countries to join into the escort program. The idea being that, the Iranians didn't necessarily try and hijack any UK ships, but the U.S. is going to come out and say that Iran did, and say, see here, this is why you guys need to join our escort program. This is exactly why we need you. See how dangerous Iran is? I think that's what this is about. This is probably trying to encourage other countries to join the escort program, and there probably wasn't any real Iranian attack. And I hesitate to even call this a false flag, because in order for a flag to be false, there kind of has to be a flag. There has to be some kind of incident to occur. You don't have the Gulf of Tonkin incident without some kind of incident occurring. So I guess better than a false flag, I'd better off just calling this a lie, because that's all it seems to be. It seems to be a made-up story, because they refused to release any evidence of it. And if you look at how this story got out, it was not in a press release from the Royal Navy. This was a leak from U.S. intelligence. U.S. folks leaked to Barbara Starr of CNN, and Barbara Starr is for all intents and purposes, she's a government mouthpiece. She takes what her sources give her, and then she reports that pretty much verbatim without criticism, because that's what she does. She's a reporter. And so the Pentagon and the intel folks seem to want to tell us, for some reason, that Iran did this. I guess they assumed that folks would just sort of take these accusations at face value and that nobody would ask for evidence. But thankfully, we're in a little bit more of a skeptical era in American history, and people did ask for evidence. And since they didn't have any evidence to provide, it would seem, because they're refusing to provide evidence, it looks like the story's just going to go away. And people are going to forget about it because it seems pretty unsubstantiated. And of course, by leaking this through an anonymous source, the U.S. government itself doesn't look bad, because they didn't come out and make the lie publicly. They did it through a leak. So I don't expect to hear anything more about this in the future. However, I will be following the Iran situation and many others closely. If you gained anything of value out of this video, I'd appreciate you clicking that like button and subscribing. And if you do subscribe, please do click the bell, because I do upload every day, and I'd hate to have you miss one. So I'll see you folks back here tomorrow.